The morning sun painted the red earth of the Navajo Nation in shades of copper and gold, casting long shadows across the small reservation school where 73-year-old Thomas Begay had just pulled up in his weathered pickup truck. The vehicle groaned to a stop in the dusty parking lot, its engine coughing like an old man clearing his throat after decades of breathing desert air. Thomas sat for a moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel, looking at the low-slung building that housed Canyon Ridge Elementary. The school served children from 3 different pueblos scattered across this remote corner of New Mexico. Children whose ancestors had walked these lands for centuries, but who now struggled to remember the stories that had once defined their people. 6 months ago, Thomas had received a call from the school's principal, a young Hopi woman named Sarah Yellowbird, who'd returned to the reservation after earning her education degree from Northern Arizona University. She'd asked if he would consider coming to the school once a week to share traditional stories with the students, particularly the boys who seemed most disconnected from their cultural heritage. Elder Begay, she'd said, using the respectful title that acknowledged both his age and his role as a keeper of tribal knowledge, we're losing them. These boys, they come to school angry, disconnected, caught between two worlds and belonging to neither. They need to hear the old stories, to understand where they come from, to know that being Native American means something powerful and beautiful. Thomas had agreed, though not without reservation. He'd spent most of his adult life as a sheep rancher, living quietly in the high desert with his wife Maria until cancer claimed her 3 years ago. He wasn't a trained teacher or a professional storyteller. He was just an old man who remembered the stories his grandfather had told him around countless fires, stories that had shaped his understanding of what it meant to be Diné, one of the people. Now, as he gathered his worn leather satchel from the passenger seat, Thomas felt the familiar flutter of nervousness that came before each visit to the school. Inside the bag were objects that had belonged to his grandfather and great-grandfather: a small drum made from elk hide, a carved wooden flute, a medicine pouch containing sage and sweetgrass, and a collection of stones and feathers that served as props for the stories he shared. The school hallways smelled of industrial cleaner and childhood, crayons, construction paper, and the indefinable scent of young energy contained within concrete walls. Thomas made his way to the library where 12 boys between the ages of 8 and 14 waited with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some sat quietly, already drawn to his presence. Others fidgeted or stared out the windows at the distant mesas, their body language broadcasting reluctance to be there. Thomas had learned over the months that these boys carried burdens no children should bear. Some lived with grandparents because their parents had succumbed to addiction or left the reservation seeking work in distant cities. Others bounced between relatives, never quite settling anywhere long enough to feel secure. Many struggled academically, caught between a school system that emphasized standardized tests and a cultural heritage that valued different kinds of knowledge altogether. "Good morning, young warriors," Thomas said, settling into the chair that had become his usual spot. The boys responded with mumbled greetings, their eyes still guarded, but no longer quite as suspicious as they'd been during his first visits. 12-year-old James Begay, no relation, though they shared the common surname, had been the most resistant initially. The boy's father had died in Iraq when James was 7, and his mother had moved to Phoenix for work, leaving James with his aging grandmother. The loss had turned a once bright child into a sullen, angry young man who seemed determined to push away anyone who tried to get close. But today, Thomas noticed something different in James's posture. The boy was still sitting apart from the others, but he was leaning forward slightly, his dark eyes focused on the leather satchel Thomas was opening. "Today I want to tell you about the Hero twins," Thomas began, his weathered hands removing the small drum from his bag. "But first I need you to understand something important. The stories I share with you aren't just entertainment. They're not like the movies you watch or the video games you play. These stories are teachings. They're maps that show us how to live, how to face challenges, how to become the men our ancestors intended us to be." 10-year-old Michael Yazzie raised his hand tentatively. Michael lived with his great-aunt because his parents were in treatment for alcohol addiction, and he often seemed years older than his age, carrying responsibilities that should have belonged to adults. "Elder Begay, my aunt says the old stories aren't real, that they're just made-up tales that don't matter anymore. She says I need to focus on school subjects that will help me get a job in the modern world. Thomas nodded thoughtfully, understanding the conflict that many families faced as they tried to navigate between traditional ways and contemporary demands. Michael, let me ask you something. When you look in the mirror, what do you see? The boy considered the question seriously. I see myself, I guess. And what do you think makes you who you are? Is it just your body, your physical form? No, sir. I think it's also my thoughts and feelings and memories. That's wise, young man. And where do you think those thoughts and feelings and memories come from? Are they just yours alone? Or do they connect you to something larger? Michael was quiet, processing the question with an intensity that impressed Thomas. I think maybe they connect me to my family, to the people who came before me. Exactly, the stories I tell you are part of that connection. They're the thoughts and feelings and memories of hundreds of generations of our people. When you hear about the hero twins, you're not just learning about two mythical characters, you're learning about the courage and wisdom and perseverance that flows through your own blood. Thomas began to tap gently on the small drum, establishing a rhythm that seemed to sync with the heartbeats of the boys gathered around him. The sound was soft but insistent, calling their attention away from the distractions of the modern world and back to something ancient and essential. Long ago, when the world was still young and dangerous monsters roamed the earth, first woman gave birth to twin boys. These weren't ordinary children. They were born to be heroes, to face the challenges that threatened to destroy all of humanity. As Thomas spoke, his voice took on the cadence of countless generations of storytellers, rising and falling like wind across the desert. The boys found themselves leaning closer, drawn into a narrative that seemed to pulse with life. The twins grew up not knowing who their father was. Their mother and grandmother raised them, teaching them everything they could about survival and courage. But there came a time when the twins knew they had to leave home, had to seek out their father and claim their true power so they could protect their people. 14-year-old Robert Platero, who'd been staring out the window just minutes before, turned his full attention to Thomas. Robert was the oldest of the group, already showing signs of the anger and resentment that often consumed teenage boys on the reservation. His own father had left when Robert was 9, and the boy had spent the last 5 years believing that he was somehow responsible for his father's abandonment. Thomas continued, the journey to find their father was dangerous and difficult. The twins had to cross treacherous terrain, face tests of courage and wisdom, prove that they were worthy of their heritage. And you know what they discovered along the way? What? Asked 8-year-old Danny Benally, the youngest of the group, his eyes wide with curiosity. They discovered that they were stronger together than either could be alone. They learned that true power comes not from conquering others, but from protecting those who cannot protect themselves. And most importantly, they realized that being abandoned or facing hardship doesn't make you weak. It makes you strong because it forces you to discover capabilities you never knew you had. Thomas watched the faces of his young audience, seeing the way certain phrases landed with particular impact on specific boys. This was the art of traditional storytelling, reading your listeners, understanding their needs, and allowing the ancient wisdom to speak directly to contemporary wounds. Over the next hour, Thomas wove the complete tale of the hero twins, their quest to find their father's sun-bearer, their battles with the monsters that threatened humanity, and their ultimate transformation into protectors of all life. But more than recounting events, he helped the boys see themselves in the story, understand how their own struggles and questions connected to this timeless narrative of growth and discovery. When the story ended, the library fell into a thoughtful silence. Finally, James Begay spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. Elder Begay, do you think the hero twins were scared when they left home to find their father? The question carried weight beyond its simple words, and Thomas recognized it as the kind of opening that storytellers live for. The moment when ancient wisdom met contemporary need. James, I think they were terrified. Think about it. They were young. They didn't know what they would face on their journey, and they had no guarantee that their father would even acknowledge them when they found him. But being scared didn't stop them. Being scared was part of what made them heroes. But what if their father didn't want them? What if he rejected them? Thomas leaned forward, his eyes meeting James's directly. You know what? Their father did reject them at first. He tested them, questioned whether they were really his sons, put them through trials that seemed impossible. But the twins didn't let that rejection define them. They proved their worth through their actions, through their courage, through their commitment to protecting others. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with other boys sharing their own questions and fears. Thomas realized that what he'd thought would be a simple storytelling session had become something much deeper, a counseling session disguised as cultural education, a healing circle wrapped in traditional narrative. After the boys returned to their regular classes, Thomas lingered in the library, thinking about the connections he'd witnessed. These children were living their own hero's journey, facing monsters that took the form of addiction, abandonment, poverty, and cultural disconnection. They needed more than just stories. They needed to understand that their struggles were part of a larger pattern, that their ancestors had faced similar challenges and found ways to not just survive, but thrive. Over the following weeks, Thomas found himself thinking constantly about the boys and their needs. He began researching traditional rites of passage, consulting with other elders about how young men had historically been guided through the transition from childhood to adulthood. What he discovered was both illuminating and heartbreaking. Most of the traditional ceremonies and teachings that had once helped boys understand their identity and purpose had been interrupted by centuries of forced assimilation and cultural suppression. The idea came to him gradually, taking shape like dawn breaking over the desert. What if he could create something that honored traditional ways while addressing contemporary needs? What if storytelling was just the beginning of a larger program designed to help these boys reconnect with their heritage and find their own paths to manhood? Thomas approached Principal Yellowbird with his proposal during one of his regular visits. He suggested expanding the storytelling sessions into a comprehensive mentorship program that would include traditional crafts, land-based learning, elder interviews, and eventually a modern interpretation of traditional coming-of-age ceremonies. The boys need more than just stories, he explained, sitting in her small office surrounded by student artwork and education policy manuals. They need to feel connected to something larger than themselves. They need to understand that being Native American isn't just about the past. It's about carrying forward values and wisdom that can help them navigate the modern world. Sarah Yellowbird listened intently, recognizing the wisdom in Thomas's words. She'd seen the gradual changes in the boys who attended his storytelling sessions: improved behavior in class, better relationships with peers, increased interest in their cultural heritage. But she also understood the practical challenges of implementing a more extensive program. Elder Begay, I love this idea, but we'd need funding for materials, transportation for field trips, approval from the school board, and honestly, we'd need more adults willing to volunteer their time. I can't ask you to carry this entire program alone. Thomas had anticipated these concerns. What if we started small? What if we focused on the boys who are most at risk, the ones who seem most disconnected? Instead of trying to serve everyone, we concentrate on the ones who need it most desperately. That evening, Thomas made a series of phone calls to people he hadn't spoken with in years. He reached out to his nephew David, who worked as a social worker in Gallup. He contacted Mary Sandoval, a retired teacher who'd spent 40 years in reservation schools. He called Robert Yassey, a Vietnam veteran who'd found healing through traditional ceremonies after struggling with what would now be called PTSD. What emerged from these conversations was a small but committed group of adults who shared Thomas's vision of using traditional wisdom to address contemporary challenges. They agreed to meet monthly to plan activities and quarterly to evaluate their progress with the boys. The expanded program launched the following semester with 8 boys selected based on academic struggles, behavioral issues, or family instability. James Begay was the first to be invited, followed by Robert Platero, Michael Yazzie, and 5 others who'd shown particular responsiveness to Thomas's storytelling. The first activity beyond storytelling was a traditional craft session where the boys learned to make prayer ties, small bundles of tobacco wrapped in colored cloth that were used in ceremonies. Thomas watched as these young hands, more accustomed to video game controllers and cell phones, carefully measured tobacco and tied knots with the focused concentration their ancestors had brought to similar tasks. "Why do we make these?" asked 10-year-old Carlos Begay, holding up his completed prayer tie. "Because the act of creating something sacred with your own hands connects you to the creative power of the universe," Thomas explained. "When you make a prayer tie, you're not just crafting an object. You're putting your intentions, your hopes, your prayers into physical form. You're participating in the same creative force that shaped the mountains and rivers." The boys worked in concentrated silence for the next hour, each lost in his own thoughts and intentions. Thomas moved among them, offering guidance and encouragement, but mostly just witnessing the transformation that occurred when young people engaged in meaningful, purposeful work. As the months passed, the program evolved organically. The boys interviewed tribal elders about their life experiences, creating an oral history project that preserved stories while helping the children understand the continuity between past and present. They learned traditional games and competed in intertribal youth gatherings. They participated in land restoration projects that connected them to environmental stewardship traditions. Most importantly, they began to see themselves differently. The anger and disconnection that had characterized many of them started to transform into pride and purpose. They carried themselves with more confidence, engaged more actively in their regular classes, and began to serve as positive influences on other students. The transformation was most dramatic in James Begay. The sullen, angry 12-year-old who'd initially resisted Thomas's stories had become a natural leader among his peers. His grades improved dramatically, and his grandmother reported that he'd begun asking questions about family history and traditional practices that had been dormant for decades. One afternoon in late spring, James approached Thomas after a storytelling session with a request that took the elder by surprise. "Elder Begay, I've been thinking about something. You know how the hero twins had to leave home to find their father and claim their power?" Thomas nodded, curious about where this conversation was heading. "Well, I think I need to do something like that. Not leave home, but do something that proves I'm ready to be a man, ready to take responsibility for myself and my family." "What did you have in mind, James?" "I want to organize a service project for our community, something that helps other people, but also shows that young Native men can be leaders, can make a positive difference." The project James envisioned was ambitious for a 13-year-old, organizing a youth-led cleanup of sacred sites that had been damaged by vandalism and neglect. He wanted to recruit boys from all three pueblos served by the school, teach them about the spiritual significance of these locations, and restore them as places of prayer and ceremony. Thomas was impressed by the scope of James's vision, but also concerned about the practical challenges involved. "James, this is a beautiful idea, but it would require coordination with tribal councils, transportation, supplies, adult supervision. It's a lot more complicated than you might realize." "I know it's complicated, Elder Begay, but the hero twins faced complicated challenges too. They didn't let difficulty stop them from doing what needed to be done." Over the next several weeks, James threw himself into planning with an intensity that amazed the adults around him. He researched tribal council procedures and attended public meetings to propose his project. He contacted local businesses to request donations of supplies and transportation. He recruited other boys from the mentorship program to serve as team leaders. Most importantly, he articulated a vision that connected traditional values with contemporary action. The Sacred Site Restoration Project wasn't just about environmental cleanup. It was about young Native men taking responsibility for preserving their cultural heritage while demonstrating to the broader community that Indigenous youth were assets rather than problems. The project took shape over the summer months, with Thomas serving as primary adult supervisor, while James handled much of the day-to-day coordination. 37 boys from 3 different pueblos participated, ranging in age from 8 to 16. They spent 6 weeks learning about traditional ecological knowledge, proper protocols for approaching sacred sites, and techniques for environmental restoration. But the most powerful aspect of the project was watching these young men develop a sense of collective identity and purpose. Boys who'd grown up feeling disconnected from their heritage began to understand themselves as part of an unbroken chain of responsibility stretching back through countless generations. The final day of the project was marked by a small ceremony at one of the restored sites. a natural spring that had been used for prayers and offerings for centuries, but had become cluttered with trash and graffiti. As the boys stood in a circle around the cleaned and blessed spring, Thomas felt a deep sense of completion, as if a cycle that had been interrupted was finally resuming its natural flow. "Young men," he said, addressing the group with the formal tone reserved for significant occasions, "today you have done something your ancestors would recognize and honor. You have acted as protectors and caretakers. You have demonstrated that being Native American means taking responsibility not just for yourselves but for the land, the water, the sacred places that sustain all life." James stepped forward to speak on behalf of the group, his voice steady and confident in a way that would have been impossible just a year earlier. "Elder Begay, we want to thank you for showing us who we really are. Before we started listening to the old stories, we thought being Native American meant we were behind everyone else, that we had to choose between our culture and success in the modern world. Now we understand that our traditions give us strength and wisdom that other people need, that we have gifts to offer the world." The ceremony concluded with the boys making individual offerings at the spring: prayer ties, sage bundles, small stones they'd carried from their home communities. As Thomas watched each young man approach the water with reverence and purpose, he thought about his grandfather and the stories that had been passed down through so many generations. That evening, as he drove home across the desert, Thomas reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 years ago, he'd been a grieving widower, wondering what purpose his remaining years might hold. He'd agreed to share stories with a small group of boys, partly out of duty, partly out of loneliness, never imagining that those sessions would evolve into something that would transform not just the children, but his own understanding of what it meant to be an elder. The boys had taught him as much as he taught them. They'd shown him that traditional wisdom remained relevant and powerful when applied to contemporary challenges. They demonstrated that young people were hungry for meaning and connection, that they would respond to authenticity and high expectations when offered with genuine care and respect. As the months turned into years, the mentorship program at Canyon Ridge Elementary became a model that was replicated in schools across the Southwest. Thomas found himself traveling to conferences and workshops, sharing what he'd learned about using traditional storytelling and cultural practices to address youth development needs. But the most meaningful validation came from the boys themselves. James Begay earned a full scholarship to study environmental science at the University of New Mexico, with plans to return to the reservation as a resource manager. Robert Platero overcame his anger and behavioral issues to become a peer mediator in high school. Michael Yazzie academic performance improved so dramatically that he was accepted into a selective summer program for gifted Native students. More importantly, all of the boys who participated in the program maintained their connection to traditional culture while successfully navigating mainstream educational and career opportunities. They became living examples of the principle Thomas had tried to teach them, that Indigenous identity was not a limitation to overcome, but a source of strength to cultivate. On a cool morning in early autumn, Thomas sat in his pickup truck outside Canyon Ridge Elementary, preparing for his weekly storytelling session. At 77, he moved more slowly than he had 4 years earlier, but his voice remained strong and his commitment to the boys unwavering. Today's group included several new faces, boys who'd heard about the program from older siblings or cousins, children who needed what the stories could provide. There were also familiar faces, younger brothers of his original students who'd begged to be included once they were old enough. As he gathered his worn leather satchel and walked toward the school entrance, Thomas thought about the story he'd chosen to share today. It was one his grandfather had told him more than 60 years ago, about a young man who discovered that his greatest power lay not in his individual strength, but in his ability to help others find their own strength. The library smelled the same as it had 4 years ago. Industrial cleaner mixed with childhood energy. But something fundamental had changed in this space. There was an expectancy in the air, a sense that important work happened here, that the ancient practice of storytelling continued to serve its essential function of helping each new generation understand their place in the great web of existence. "Good morning, young warriors," Thomas said, settling into his familiar chair and beginning to open his satchel. The boys responded with enthusiasm, their eyes bright with anticipation. As he began to tell the story of the young man who discovered his true power through service to others, Thomas felt the presence of all the storytellers who had come before him. His grandfather, his great-grandfather, countless generations of keepers of wisdom who had understood that the stories were never really about the past, but always about the future, about helping each new generation find their way forward while staying connected to the wisdom of those who had walked the path before them. The story flowed from his lips like water from a spring, ancient and eternal, carrying within it everything these boys needed to know about courage, identity, and the sacred responsibility of being human. And in their faces, Thomas could see the future of his people, young men who would carry forward the stories, the values, and the unbreakable connection between past and future that made them who they were meant to be.